thank you everybody who's online and joining us for actually a really somewhat groundbreaking session. I'm sure when we look back, we'll realize exactly how extraordinary it is to have these young women taking part in this panel. So this is part of the series from the Global Leadership for the Fourth Industrial Revolution by Thunderbird University, Thunderbird School of Management. And it's a multi-stakeholder driven platform. We're looking in response to the COVID-19 crisis and how can we build forward better? You may have heard of building back better, but we are actually looking at how can we build forward better? And in some ways, this crisis has given us an extraordinary opportunity to think differently about absolutely everything. And fundamental to that are economic systems. And part of what we know will help us move to the next level, will help us recover, are systems of philanthropy and also the gift economy and all the other ways in which we as communities support each other to build on our resilience and to fulfill our dreams for post-COVID futures. So our dreams have not been invalidated by this crisis. Our dreams are very much alive. There are many communities that are now beginning to think about how they can do things differently. So we're really honored that these have joined us today. And this is really a curtain raiser for a series of events that we'll be having later on, which will look at the strengths and the wealth that we have in Africa, and wealth beyond money, wealth in terms of capacity, in terms of culture, in terms of so many things, and how that wealth can help us to do things differently and to recover. So I'd like to welcome each and every one of our panelists. And perhaps some of you may have seen the flyer and be expecting Her Excellency, Rachel Ruto, to join us. She is the second lady of Kenya. She's the spouse of the Deputy Prime Minister. She's been very much at the forefront of driving financial inclusion conversations for women, looking at different types of banking system, tabletop, etc. So she was not able to join us today because of the vagaries of politics. As you know, things change rapidly, and those that are in the political sphere are called upon to respond at short notice. So she was called away for an event in Parliament this morning, and she gave us a video. Unfortunately, we're not able to show that video right now, but it will be edited into a final clip, which will have this conversation and some of what she said. But I'd like to perhaps talk about two of the things that she talked about. She talked about how we can begin to value the wisdom of women. And so it was intentional for us to have women and young women on this panel. And that is because we want to have a conversation about how women do things differently in every sector, banking, finance, and how women often have a more holistic view of recovery and have a different perspective on resilience. So our young women here represent the future of many of those things that we're talking about. And so I'd like to introduce, starting from my screen on the top left, I'd like to introduce Marianne Ochella. She's the Senior Regional Chapter Manager of East Africa, Aspen Institute of Development Entrepreneurs. And that may be an institute that you've heard of. And if you haven't heard of it, then I'd invite you to take a second look. I'd like to ask you, Marianne, can you tell me how your world and your community has changed professionally and perhaps personally in this COVID crisis? How has it changed? And perhaps you tell me where you are dialing in from.
Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon in Nairobi, Kenya. That's where I'm dialing from. As Dr. Sheila just introduced me, I'm the Senior Regional Chapter Manager for ANDI in East Africa. ANDI is the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. We're a policy program of the Aspen Institute. And this is a network, a 300 organization strong network of organizations that are working to support entrepreneurship in emerging markets. The reason we're very passionate about entrepreneurship is we believe it's an under-leveraged tool when it comes to tackling the SDGs. How has my world changed? Perhaps I could start with just as a person, I'm a young mother. So just the juggling act in itself, I'm seeing everyone around the screen smiling. I mean, so that's how it's gone topsy-turvy. So it's taking multitasking to the next level. But in terms of the small and growing business ecosystem, which is what Andy looked to impact, the first thing that we did when COVID struck is, together with Dalberg, which is an international development advisory firm, we surveyed the 300 member organizations of Andy. And what we learned is that 50% of the businesses that they support were expected to fail. As at June, when we went back, 12% of that 50 had already failed as a result of COVID. 18% of the organizations themselves that support entrepreneurship were considering themselves to be at high risk. So what that means, if you're an organization that supports entrepreneurs, then entrepreneurs are no longer able to access that support. And the third and the biggest impact, in my view, is that women-led businesses were more likely to close compared to their mixed gender or male-led businesses. And we also learned that the sectors where women are overrepresented were the worst hit. So this is tourism, hospitality, trading, and manufacturing.
Much, Marianne. Nazar, I'd like to turn to you. Nazar is a senior advisor for UNICEF, and she's also a founder of the SAGE Innovation organization. I'd like you to perhaps tell me where you have seen pockets of resilience harness to help us in this post-COVID recovery, and where are you dialing from?
Thank you, Dr. Sheila. Hello, everyone. Very excited to be here today. I'm coming in from London, but majority of our responses during COVID have been in Nigeria. SAGE Innovation Center primarily focuses on environmental sustainability in low-income communities. So, of course, when COVID happened, it was, as Marianne said, it was a complete shock, and having to reorganize a lot of the programs that we had planned to do over Easter, and we really had to mobilize ourselves. And during this time, we actually launched SAGE Emergencies, which focuses on the COVID response by distributing soap, food, and other amenities within refugee camps and vulnerable communities. We actually found that the best way for us to mobilize ourselves, especially because we weren't on ground, was to partner with existing international organizations and institutions that were on the front line. It's been, it was challenging for us to kind of figure out, in which direction we were going to go in, because we weren't sure how long this was going to last. But considering that COVID is likely to be, here for some time, it's, we find it that it's very important now to focus on this and focus on responding, especially towards women and children. And, in terms of education, of course, for some of us, we've been very lucky to be in a place where we are able to actually socially distance. We have access to water, we have access to soap, we have access to food, but a lot of these communities that, we've generally worked in, especially in Northeast Nigeria, this wasn't the case. So, it's really about seeing the underlying issues at this point. And, this COVID-19 actually presented a very great opportunity in highlighting systemic inequality within these communities, and how we as how different communities can mobilize themselves in a time like this. So we really focused on women, children, and the most disadvantaged, and we're continuing to do so. But we also see the urgency of us tackling climate issues, especially on the continent. during this period, we saw increase in the number of droughts. We saw, swarms of locusts that are threatening food insecurities. So, we are focusing on COVID. However, in the next 6 months to a year, we are currently planning on how we're going to move forward and deploy, environmental solutions within these areas.
So much, very important. So I'd like to also introduce our third speaker, third contributor on this panel, Wanjuhi Njoroge. She is part of the Global Shapers Foundation, which is a World Economic Forum organization. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the work that you are doing professionally and personally. Where are you seeing bright lights in the seeming darkness of this crisis?
Thank you, Dr. Sheila. The Global Shapers community is an initiative of the World Economic Forum, targeting people who are below 30. We are in 400 cities and about 11,000 young people. And when COVID struck, the first thing we did was creating safe spaces for these young people to come together and just talk about how they were feeling and taking care of our mental health. COVID-19 had exposed glaring gaps. Sorry, I'm pausing because I have an echo. But then for me, how I see hope is that these networks, such as the Global Shapers community, allow us to come together and solve societal problems. It gives us, we are able to come together, mobilize resources, unite our skills and expertise, and
we may have lost Wanjuhi, but I'm sure she'll dial back in and later. Conversation. Thank you very much for bearing with us in these new realities, and we're all upskilling on communicating through these platforms, so we'll keep going. I just want you to know that I'm going to ask questions in like 3 broad categories. We're going to talk about people in terms of building resilience, but then we're going to perhaps are embedded in that, and some that we can use, and platforms can be community platforms, they can be networks, they can be digital. So I'll invite our speakers, our panelists, to actually speak to that. So Marianne, you were talking about female-led businesses before, and really how much more vulnerable they are in this time and how much harder they are finding it to recover. So I'd like to know what are the threads that are helping them to hold on, and what can we do? What can the business community do to help female-led businesses to bounce back and to build forward better?
Yeah, so, and the interesting thing around gender inequality, and particularly the impacts that COVID has had, on particularly gender, it's not something new. It's inequalities that have existed. So what the crisis or the pandemic has done is exacerbate those. So for us, it's really things that we've always known, but now there's sort of an urgency to tackle that. And one of the things that we've always known, for example, in the network, we've carried a longitudinal study of small and growing businesses across multiple years, calling it the Global Accelerator Learning Initiative. And this is going to accelerators and tracking the difference between businesses that are accepted into accelerator programs and how they fare on after, compared to businesses that have not. And one of the things that we realized, even when women-led businesses are accepted into accelerators, they are not able to go on to access the same level of funding that either mixed teams or male-led businesses are able to do. So one of the things we've done is, number one, realize that the programming must be distinct. Programming targeted at women-led businesses must be aware of certain things. Number one, women function better in informal conversations with investors. Yeah, you're not just, the way we have these pitch nights and then we come and put women, it doesn't work for women-led businesses as well as it does for men. So that's an example of a targeted approach. So when it comes to COVID, similarly, the same thing. It's understanding that women bear a disproportionate amount of housework, for example. So when we talk about their businesses, we need to talk about digitization. How do we support women to digitize their businesses so they can still be able to run their households, but also, pivot their businesses? So that could be one of the responses, for example. The second is the way we package financing mechanisms for businesses. Yeah, a lot of women are very, in our experience, do not understand, are not averse to equity, for example. So how do we put together debt instruments? How do we put together repayable grants? How do we measure impact with a gender lens? So it's looking at everything through a gender lens and not just lumping entrepreneurs together. So that's one of the responses or the message that's coming out of our network.
That was very clear. Thank you so much. Nazar, I'd like to come back to some of the points that you just touched upon, but that perhaps you can expand on. So we're looking at people, and you were talking a lot about inequality and what COVID has highlighted, the inequities and the inequality gaps that they're there. And so can you tell us perhaps how this is showing up in the work that you're doing, and perhaps will it change how you program your work or advocate supporters?
Yeah, so as Marianne said, it's really, I think COVID has significantly highlighted the impact that a crisis of any sort has on women. We do generally have more responsibility and do carry more burden. And the way we have seen this pan out within low-income communities is the impact that not being at school has on women and girls. We're seeing an increase in child marriages and, young girls having to do more chores, more housework, and not having the time to study. And especially in low-income communities, they don't have access to, an iPad or a laptop where they can log on, or internet or electricity for that matter. So it's definitely, made me consider a lot more how, for example, a crisis like the COVID crisis or the climate crisis could have these impacts on women and on young girls. So it has definitely driven me to look at my work through a more gendered lens and support women through that, because it is really, the impact has been catastrophic. So really looking at those holes right now and how we get children back to school, with the right safety measures in place. We supported a school of 5,000 girls in Northeast Nigeria in collaboration with UNICEF, and they really mobilized the school in getting face masks, hand washing while social distancing, and the education, because it's really important for young girls to be back in school and for children generally to be back in school. So
much important point. And perhaps so you're looking at, you raised the point about child marriages and how vulnerable young girls are to this. And so we are responding, as it were, to challenges as they come. But now, perhaps when we begin to think about systemic change, so the fact that educating a girl is seen as somewhat burdensome in many ways, and perhaps advocacy has allowed more girls to go to school. But now, where in some countries, as in Kenya, they're having to repeat a year, which is double the financial burden that a parent perhaps thought they were going to invest, or, in other places, just that they just can't see the point anymore of even trying to invest in female education. So how do we work to highlight systemic change issues because a lot of our work is often just at stemming the flow of need. So now I'm moving on to questions on processes. Where are we going? What can we do to actually look at systems change? So I'll start with you, Nazar, and I'll ask the same question to Marianne. And when Juhi joins us again, and I know she's trying really hard, this platform is problematic on other devices apart from a laptop. So she's trying to log in with a phone and an iPad, I think. So she'll join us, and I will put the questions to her when she joins as well. But perhaps, Nazar, you would like to respond on how can we look at this as a systems change necessity?
Yeah, so I think you touched on a very good point. I think a lot of parents from this crisis are simply frustrated, and they do see this. Number one, they see educating their daughters as a financial burden, and on top of this, having to repeat a second year. It is a lot of burden. So I think, in terms of systemic change, is really looking at how we as women are advocating for the rights of young girls, and how, what we're educating them with, what values are we instilling with them as parents, as women, as teachers, as parents, as friends. What are we teaching them? What are we telling them the right things are to do? And how do we empower them and give them a voice and give them the right tools and power, and platforms, as Marianne said, how do we give them access to digitization? How do we give them, more opportunities? And I think, Marianne, I'll pass that back on to you, because I think there's a lot of similarities in what we're talking about.
Absolutely, Nazar. And I think one of the things that even when we talk about entrepreneurship and why gender equality is so important, is 57% of women in emerging markets are self-employed. Yeah, so it's more than half of women are not in the formal, labor force. That means they are either running micro enterprises, or they're running enterprises that are big enough to employ others. And particularly women. And that's why, even as we talk about the agency that Nazar, you're talking about, agency that starts from dignity and just feeling that, you can run something and you can make a decision and you can have an impact in your community. What we think about in our sector is then, how do we empower you? How do we support you to grow? Because I think for a very long time, microfinance has almost been synonymous with women. Yeah, but women are not going to run small businesses forever. It's not, the idea is that they will start small, but then they will grow and they will become job creators. And it starts from, Nazar, what you're talking about, the education system and how we teach them these skills. But even when they start the business, are there people, organization, is there philanthropy that's investing in the public goods required for women to become employers in their own right, to become managers in their own right? For the people that are making investments into these businesses, those fund managers, are they women? Because if I'm running a fund as a woman, I'm more likely to apply a gender lens when I'm making an investment into a female-led business. So it's removing the layers and layers of ceilings until we get to a point where women are actually running policy, right? Because I think even in corporates, you see a lot of women in middle management, but then you don't see. So it's about that. How do we continue layering and layering and layering? And how do we all, because I think the other thing with international development is thinking in silos, So the humanitarian sector just operates separately. The entrepreneurship sector operates separately. But the woman is the same. It's this one woman. So how does philanthropy as well become more integrated? How do we get better? How do we build products? How do we learn in such a way that then international development becomes more effective at empowering women across society?
Fantastic. I love both your interventions. So, Wanji, we can't see you, but I think you are available on audio. Are you?
Yes, I am.
Great. That's fantastic. So you were just introducing the work that you do, and I was very intrigued and interested in the fact that you touched on mental health issues, which are really important, especially with young people now, in terms of supporting young people to find their footing again, to be able to move forward. Perhaps you continue telling us a little bit more about what you're doing. And the first part of our conversation was about the communities we're working with. And the second part was about the processes. So perhaps you can also tell us what processes underlie the work that you do at the Global Shapers Foundation that help to empower your community. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheila. So as I said earlier, the community worked extremely hard. Work very hard to bring the members of this community who are between the ages of 18 and 29, ensuring that they had safe spaces, and they still have safe spaces to come together and talk about the issues and how COVID-19 has affected them. And that has enabled us to be whole before going back to serving our community, and we serve as volunteers. I would say we are the face of youth philanthropy. We may not give money, but we give of ourselves, we give of our skills, and we also give of our networks. When it comes to the communities we work in, and I really love the question on educating girls. We do a lot of mentorship in rural areas just to see that we increase the transition from primary to high school for girls. And this came about due to cases of teenage pregnancies. You find one of the high schools we went to, and I remember that first year, which was in 2016, we had 8 cases of teenage pregnancies. One girl gave birth, I think, a few days to the national examination. And when we convened the parents' meeting, the parents would stand up and say, my daughter has gone all the way to high school, but I dropped out in primary school. And we realized 2 things. That first, we needed to involve the community as well as start very early, because high school was sort of damage control. And so we went to the primary level, and we have projects that have been funded by, say, Safaricom, which is the leading telco in Kenya. But then we brought the community, the parents, and the students together in one room, and we started showing the importance of educating girls. We took girls who have become lawyers, who've gone ahead becoming engineers, and we exposed these kids and the parents to the potential of transforming an entire village once you educate a girl. I am a girl who was born and brought up in the village, and when I go to my village and we have mentorship, they believe, because they have seen me go through education, and they have seen me, and they've seen how education can transform. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to move these conversations from wonderful hotels and take them to the grassroots, to where the people are. And when you look at Africa, we have 70% living in rural areas. So it's extremely important for us to also invest, and philanthropists to invest in civic education that teaches the community on the importance of educating girls, not just educating girls, of even participating in policy formulation. Because, for instance, when you look at the Kenyan Constitution, demands that civic participation or the public participation is mandatory before passing of any laws in Kenya. So it's extremely important that we have an all stakeholders approach when formulating policies as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I can see in the chat a point was raised that I'd like to pose to all of you before we move on to our next section, which is platforms. One of our in the chat, one of our audience members, Gladys, has talked about how can we demystify cultural norms that hinder women's advancement. So I think perhaps we should begin to think about how we do that, and perhaps Nazar, especially in the work you do in northeastern Nigeria, Muslim communities, but not because they're Muslim communities, but it's cultural, bigger cultural norms across the world that sometimes are barriers to female advancement. And so perhaps you can talk about how we can begin to address that. Are we going to do that? Because in many ways, we've seen advancement in terms of the things that are visible, women going to school, having access to employment, but culture takes a long time to change, to shift. Mindsets take a long time. How perhaps are you thinking about that, and what any insights you can give us, please?
Yeah, so I think, again, this really goes back to open communication within communities and education, not just for the girls, but also for families. And, really raising the issue and the importance of, inclusivity for their daughters, for women in general. And highlighting the issues that come with, and this was something that I believe was overcome in certain parts of Africa with female genital mutilation. I think what we had to do is really speak to community leaders and heads of religious groups that can talk to their community, and really talking about safe practice as opposed to forced practice of doing something like that. But this is again highlighting the importance of a woman in education and how she can prosper, and still sticking to certain cultural values, because I think in certain parts of the world this is definitely something that a lot of communities and cultures are scared about, is basically humanitarian organizations forcing their almost liberal values on young girls from a culture that's different to the West. And that's, it's not necessarily changing cultural values, it's including, their cultural values in addition to the importance of, their daughters getting an education and, studying for as long as they can, and, with means of access, and, and encouraging it through that. But it's a delicate conversation, to be honest, and one that's continuing to develop as time goes on. So that's the way we're aiming to hopefully deploy.
Thank you very much. And so that you've touched on all the important points that I was thinking about, and working with the family, understanding the context, and understanding really what that community wants for itself. So it's not about imposing your vision of more modernity on that community, but for them saying how they would like to advance within their cultural value systems. Marianne, I'd like to ask you, in terms of financial institution, finance industry, financial institutions have their own culture. And thanks for talking about the ceilings, which are layers upon layers, and I think that's an important visual to actually hold on to. Breaking the glass ceiling, the first woman on the board, the first woman CEO. And yet you look at the fact that a lot hasn't changed, because the culture within financial industries hasn't changed. So what can we do?
I mean, Dr. Sheila, isn't it tragic that in 2020 we still say the first woman this and last woman that, So just to emphasize that. But yeah, in the entrepreneurship space, one of the things that we also are doing is collecting evidence around certain interventions and saying that this works. One of that, for example, is if you're going to train entrepreneurs, having an all-women cohort, for example, and training them, because that feeling of intimidation that usually comes when you're put in a room with, male entrepreneurs who tend to be more outwardly confident, that has been shown to affect how the woman feels in terms of even presenting herself as an entrepreneur. All of a sudden, you start minimizing your business. You start saying, oh, I'm still trying. I still haven't, But when you put women together in general, it is empowering. The second thing is peer-to-peer networks or peer-to-peer mentorship. And here we apply something we call the tennis ball rule, that if you find a successful female entrepreneur, for example, in Kenya, Tabitha from Keroshe Breweries, and have her mentor female entrepreneurs, the impact is so different from when you just bring a successful male entrepreneur, for example. And these things sound obvious, but they're not incorporated in programs. That's why I want to belabor the point. The third and the most important is that our financial systems are not built with a gender lens. So that's why you still have collateral requirements when it is generally understood that it's not women that hold the paperwork, for example, for land and things like that. So one of the things is supporting investors develop financing instruments that are aware of that. So you say, for example, instead of asking a woman that owns a school to give you the title deed to that school, because chances are she doesn't hold it, even if she's running it. How about you put together a funding mechanism that says, if you increase your students from X to 2X, I am going to give you $1,000 more, $10,000 more. If you increase that from that to that, and women have been shown to outperform when the funding mechanism is results-based, for example, as opposed to tying it to collateral. And the last is also mindset training of investors themselves and the gender biases that are inherent in the way we make our investments. And we cannot emphasize having more women as fund managers, having more funds that have women at the top, obviously, is shown to make a difference as well.
Great point. Wanjuli, let me, perhaps you can help us move on to the next part of our conversation, the final part, which is about platforms. So the initiative you're involved in is within an extraordinary platform, the World Economic Forum, which helps it to have access to knowledge and visibility. So we are having this conversation in an incredible platform, which is looking at the Global Compact. So this is the UN platform, which gives us access to global communities. So the question I want to ask is, how do you work within platforms? So, you know, it can be complicated. The UN has its own agenda. World Economic Forum has its own agenda. Your initiative has its own agenda. How do you stay true to what your agenda is as you work with platforms? Because, you know, partnerships are important, but how do you do that in a way that doesn't disempower you or lessen your voice or mask your own mission? Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Sheila. What I have learned is that all these platforms, including the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, they give us access to, for instance, their biggest events, such as the Davos meeting, because we have something important. And so that in itself is powerful, and it gives us the liberty to go in and negotiate for what we believe in or what we are pursuing as individuals or what we believe in as individuals, because it's an added advantage to us. So we go in as equal partners, and we are, I was in Davos this year, for instance, and I was given a chance to, or rather, I earned myself a chance to speak at one of the biggest panels, because I've done a lot of work fighting for forests in Kenya, and I'm now working in restoration. So knowing that I come in as an equal partner or as an equal member of this platform gives me the liberty to go in and negotiate. The other thing is having very, very strong integrity and ethos that guide me as well. So when I go into the negotiating table, I know at the back of my mind there are things that I'm not willing to sacrifice to, for instance, get funding for a restoration project or an education project. So I will work with partners who treat me and see what I bring on the table as valuable. So it's important to go in knowing A, that I'm a valuable partner, and B, that I also have I have to have the interest of my people, and my people, this is the Global South, at heart. So I cannot negotiate on that as well. So they have their interest and I have my interest, but at the end of the day, we are all equal because we are human beings. There's something I bring to the table that is the voice of the young people, in as much as they have the money. So when I think about philanthropy, I think we need to start looking at it from a point of being fair. We need to go to the negotiating table as fair people. So you might be giving me the money, but you probably want the markets in Africa. And that in itself is a very, very powerful negotiating tool that we tend to forget. I think the other thing that ails us is our corrupt leaders, and this has been exposed during the COVID crisis. COVID has exposed glaring leadership gaps. And this has inspired me as a young person to consider running for political office, because if we do not run for political office as young people, then they will continue making decisions for themselves, which are not people-centered. So I feel that even in as much as we appreciate philanthropy, I think philanthropy needs to be questioned. Yes, you're giving us your money, but what are the terms that we are agreeing to? So when we are even looking at the platforms that we have, such as the World Economic Forum, such as the United Nations, we from the Global South need to ask ourselves, what are we taking to the table, and what are we willing to compromise on to get the money, for instance, that we need so badly. And we as young people also need to rise to the occasion and run for political office. Of course, that's a different conversation altogether, because when you think about politics on this side of the savannah, it's quite expensive and you need a lot of money to run. But I feel that if we came together, we're going to see a lot of changes as well.
Thank you so much. You've raised really important points. I want to reiterate a few of them because I think they're. Number one, I love that you said, I earned myself the chance to speak at that event. And that was referring back to what Marianne was talking about. So often when you are in a platform, women minimize what they brought to it. And that in itself puts you in a weak negotiating position. And the fact that you know that you are in a negotiation and that you come with something and others come with something, understanding that you are at the table. Somebody said to me last week, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So you need to be at the table so that you are not used as collateral for something else. And that's really important. So thank you for saying that. Looking at leadership, if you get the leadership you deserve, as many people have said sometimes about our systems, and if you don't want it, what are you doing to make to make a shift, the next generation? And how can you stand up and be counted in that? So it's wonderful to hear that young people are saying we are going to stand up and be counted and we want to do things differently. We need a systems change. That is absolutely wonderful. So Nazar, I want to come to you. And because you work in Sage Innovations, but you also work with UNICEF, and within both you're working with policymakers and you're looking at the same time trying to get things done. You're trying to navigate how you can create policy shifts and create a more enabling environment for you to do your work better. And so within that, you're generally sitting at a table with male counterparts. That probably is what happens mostly when you're sitting with governments, especially on our continent. So how do you incorporate male allies into the work that you do and help create space for help in this the shift in terms of how we do our work and with a gender lens?
Yeah, so I think the one of the most important things for me, and one of the most significant changes that I've seen is that I think if you provide a plan, or if you provide some sort of response, you always find that, as Marianne said before, women generally have a very holistic approach to how they deploy within a crisis or within an emergency. And really bringing that to the table and showing the different perspectives and showing the results from the different types of intervention. It's really important for us to consider these things as we go along, and how do we propose our ideas and our plans to male counterparts? How do we make it easier for them, or how do we come on board together? And I think this is really important in every sort of humanitarian intervention, is to have ideas coming from all angles. So not necessarily just women, not necessarily just from every single angle. And that way we can really account for the different types of cultures, gender, personalities. And, I find that these methods are probably, the most effective. Sometimes you do want to scream and shout and, to create some sort of a shift and to get your point across, because because the status quo has been accepted for so long. So how do we change the narrative, and how do we, as women in these positions, how do we influence people through good work and through results?
Really important points. So Marianne, I want to ask you about how helpful the SDGs are in terms of helping people to frame the conversations around what needs to happen for this transition. Are they helpful? And how are you trying to work with them in your sector?
Yeah, so we've been supporting entrepreneurship in emerging markets for the last 11 years. And this is the first time in our updated strategy that we have tried to link small and growing businesses and SDGs. And what we did is really speak to organizations supporting entrepreneurs and to entrepreneurs themselves and ask the question, which SDGs in particular do you think entrepreneurship is well placed to solve? And we arrived at 3: gender equality, climate action, and decent work. So we have picked those 3 SDGs in particular and asked, how do we support the sector in one, understanding the SDG, and second, starting to think of ways of addressing it that are systemic. So not just, again, going back to the silo conversation, not just throwing money at one aspect of it, but looking at it end to end. And I'll talk about gender equality because that's where we've started to chip at. So what we're doing is, across all our 8 chapters around the world, is speaking to enterprise support organizations and asking them, what are these perpetual challenges you see that keeps standing in the way of women-led entrepreneurship thriving? And then once we get those challenges, so we problem frame in country. So it is people supporting women-led businesses in Kenya defining that problem. It's not the other way around, which is what usually happens. Then once we problem frame, then we ask, what sort of initiative do you think would respond to this sustainably? And then once that is framed, that's when you approach the philanthropic community and say, we understand the problem, we have framed a solution, and now we're asking you to partner in bringing this to fruition. So that bottom-up approach, we think, is very well placed to solve that. And once we test that, we will move that to climate action, and we will move that to decent work.
So we have like 10 minutes. I'd like to now try to anchor our conversations around the major theme of this panel, which is building philanthropic resiliency. So we've talked a lot about our communities, our processes, the platforms, but philanthropy as it is currently is understood in a particular way. You understand the big organizations that come from wealthy families or wealthy institutions who basically choose where they want to. Apologies if that is me. Sorry. And so they philanthropic way and understood in a particular way. So I'd like to bring the conversation to, or I'd like to offer a different way of understanding it, that our communities across the global South, so not just in Africa, understand about supporting each other, the gift economy, and in many ways, we have been our brothers and sisters' keeper. We have welfare systems that are embedded in our cultures and our ways of doing things. And perhaps they may not be seen as philanthropy because they're not wealth-owning families donating to perhaps particular causes that are close to their heart. But there is inherent wealth in different ways. So as we move forward, how can we build on those ways of supporting each other in our communities? And perhaps we can look at it at the whole system of philanthropy, and how can we work with our partners in the South, so more South-South philanthropic collaborations, so that they're not standalone organizations trying to do particular things in particular localities. So I think Wanjuhi is back on the line. Wanjuhi, are you there? Great. So perhaps we'll start with you, because you were the one that actually said we need to rethink how we understand philanthropy. And so perhaps you'd like to start the conversation here about how we rethink that and rebuild it.
Thank you, Sheila. And you know, gifting is an African culture. When you think about Ubuntu and how many African cultures would come together and work together and help each other, maybe deal with a task. And I think Rwanda has a day every month where they come together and help each other work. So it has always been a part of us, I think, and it's important for us as we think about philanthropy to go back to who we really are as Africans. And borrow from our cultures, our traditions, those that are good, and borrow from them, because we've always been gifting. I think the other thing I would want to say is that we need to shout more about the people who are gifting. We rarely talk about people who are gifting, but we have people who, on the global south, who are gifting other Africans. And you will see this will inspire a gifting culture, because I feel we constantly focus on the West and what the West is doing, but we forget to tell our stories. And we have people who are actually gifting. And I would want to talk about the young people. We may not have the money, but majority are investing their time, investing what they have learned in school, and looking at this as an opportunity to gain experience as well. And for organizations that do a lot of philanthropy on this side of the Sahara, I think it would also be important to tap into this knowledge. This gives us a chance to experience, to work firsthand, and they can tap into networks such as the Global Shapers community, the Scouts that are already organized. And I feel this is another aspect of philanthropy that we rarely talk about. We focus more on the money, but I feel there's another, and especially now that we're talking of unemployment in the youngest continent, being very, very high. I think one of the ways is giving these young people an opportunity to volunteer their time, to volunteer their skills as well. Imagine, you know, we've done a lot of ICT literacy as a Global Shapers community in the rural areas. And I remember once we went to a school that's just 2 hours out of Nairobi, and the kids could not open the lid of a laptop. But we have many ICT graduates who are sitting at home and they do not have jobs. Imagine if we could tap into them and allow them to contribute or to give back to their society, teach kids how to code. We are left behind, yet we're in the fourth industrial revolution. We have a chance to leapfrog. And how can we leapfrog? It's tapping into these young brains who are not working, but they have something to offer to society. So I think when I say we need to rethink philanthropy, I think it's, I'm a believer. And so what are you holding in your hand? Those were the words that Moses asked. What are we holding in our hands as Africans that we can use to grow ourselves, even without relying on the West? And remember now, COVID-19 will now make them focus more locally as opposed to internationally. They might go back to international giving, but they might want to first focus on solving the problems at home before they move out.
Great, concise answer.
Other sectors.
Nazar, perhaps you can really also add to this.
Yeah, so I think, looking at some of the, foundation and, how do we get philanthropy how do we make philanthropy effective on the continent and on the global south generally? And I think there's a few, obviously, as you mentioned, meeting the SDGs, looking at some of the foundational issues. I mean, having lived in Nigeria for 7 years now, it's for me one of the biggest problems that we have is infrastructure and access to electricity. These are foundational issues that we need to fix before, progressing on to other means. So how do we assess within a certain context what our issues are, and how do we address those issues, and then continue to build on top of that through your philanthropy of something that lies close to your heart. Another thing that I think is really important is to utilize the youth population that's in Africa. Not only do we have a very large youth population, but they're also incredibly talented and eager to do wonderful things. They just don't have the right tools in certain situations, and access to the right materials. So I think creating these opportunities for the youth and building a foundation that's strong enough. So building, against climate, building climate resilient cities, climate resilient infrastructure. This permits us to grow upwards as opposed to growing, halting, coming back down, growing. It will give us a strong foundation will essentially give us what we need for necessary and strong society.
Thanks so much.
So from an entrepreneurship lens, I'd like to look at it in two ways. So the first is we still receive an overwhelming amount of philanthropy from the global north. So the question is, how do we get away from that sort of patriarchal top-down in a way that funding is actually coming to local organizations that understand the context of the environments we're working with, and that those local organizations, be it an enterprise support organization, is a partner and not just a recipient, and they have the agency to even say no to money that they feel will not advance the needs of that community. So one is that agency and being locals as partners, not as beneficiaries. And that term beneficiary, completely getting rid of it, right? The second one is from a perspective of local capital. So we have high net worth individuals in this continent. We have remittances from the millions of Africans that are living abroad, forming about 2% of African GDP. But these remittances positively affect their families at a micro level. So they have better health outcomes, they have better education outcomes, which is great. But how do we transition even that income stream to be sustainable? So I think it's about organizing. It's about starting to think of ourselves as angel investors. It's about, instead of me taking my savings and buying a piece of land, investing in an entrepreneur who's doing something interesting. And because I've been a banker before, supporting them as well in terms of, this is how you build a balance sheet. This is how you track your cash flows. So we have skills and we have capital even within the continent. So how do we organize it to complement external ODA?
It's fantastic. That was so well put. And we have like 3 minutes. Let me just, first of all, before they kick us out of this forum, thank Thunderbird for giving us this platform, and thank really them for thinking about it in such a way that the panel of the wise women, and really I have a lot of wisdom, and not just wisdom in the sense of old and ancient, but wisdom in terms of vibrant and innovative and new and exciting. And so you don't often have the association of wisdom and youth and innovation. But here, I think this panel has actually shown that is really what we need moving forward. And thank you also for putting it within the broader context of the fourth industrial revolution. There is a change coming in terms of how we live, how our economies work. And in that revolution, young people must be featured more, women must be featured more. We need to embrace technologies in different ways and apply them and make them, work for us, and do it within the context and the values that we hold. Thank you so much, Marianne. Thank you, Nazar. Thank you, Wanjui. And I would like to close this session, but perhaps we have like 2 minutes. You have 1 minute, maybe less than a minute, 30 seconds to say a final closing word. There's going to be a series, so we will come back to all of you later on in the year, but perhaps you'd like to say something. I'll start with Wanjuhi, quickly and succinctly.
Thank you, Dr. Sheila. I believe when I see this panel of wise women, I am inspired to believe in the future, and I believe that we as the Global South have so much power in ourselves if we agreed to take up leadership. I am encouraging all of us to seek political leadership, because this is where the laws are passed. This is where policies are formulated, and we really, really must take up political leadership. Let us put our heads together and see how can we support young women and young people in general to run for political. That we had people-centered leadership, and it would be very, very wrong for me to not mention climate action. Let's also join the push for climate action, especially the restoration of nature.
Thank you. Nazar, 10 seconds.
No, as I think, as sad as this crisis has been, a lot of people have lost their lives, and a lot of people have had to change their day-to-day behavior. It's been a very difficult time for a lot of people, but I think it also presents a very big opportunity for us as women to, understand and see the systemic inequality, see gender inequality, and actually do something about it through our work. So thank you. It's been an honor speaking to you guys.
Wonderful. Marianne?
I think for me is to take the title of this resilience, to say that narratives matter. So when we talk about resilience, it is a strength. And that we should look at that as a strength. And even to the philanthropic community, still say that out of the total ODA, still 2%, less than 2% is what is being directed towards SME-related activities. So SMEs are the future. They're employing our young people. I think we should put a lot more energy into that because it's still very underleveraged when we think about SDGs.
Thank you, everyone. And to our audience, thank you so much for sending such great messages in the chat. We will review, the videos will come out. Everybody, peace, love, blessings. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.